My mom ignored me while I was fighting for my life, and you won't believe what happened. I never imagined I would feel so much fear inside my home, a fear that didn't come from strangers, but from those who should have been my safe haven. It was a cold September night about 4 years ago that everything changed. I was in my room, trying to study for final exams, when a sharp pain started in my abdomen. At first, I thought it was something I'd eaten, but the pain quickly became unbearable, a knot that tightened my chest and took my breath away. I tried to call my mother, Carolina, but she was in Helena's room, adjusting my older sister's medication, who had always had health problems that seemed to consume everyone's attention. I tried to scream, but my voice faltered. The pain throbbed as if each heartbeat increased the pressure inside me. I felt invisible. That night became the first time I realized that my mother's love had limits that didn't include my pain. When she finally came to my room with tired eyes and a burdened expression, it took minutes to understand that it wasn't a whim, not teenage drama. But deep down, I felt like she saw me too late. My name is Raphael. I was 16 at the time, and I'd always been the more independent or smarter child according to everyone. Helena, my older sister, was always the focus, the source of my mother's constant worry. And me? I felt like a shadow, invisible in my own home. For years, I silently accepted this neglect, convincing myself I wasn't important, that my physical and emotional pain wasn't worth the effort. But that night, as my body writhed in pain, the feeling of abandonment hit me like a punch in the gut. Helena was by my side, holding my hand, murmuring words of comfort, trying to fill the void my mother left. I could hear Carolina's hurried footsteps in the hallway, trying to organize medications, appointment schedules, and phone calls to doctors. It was as if my pain were invisible, as if my existence had to wait until her attention was available. The fear of dying alone, ignored, left me feeling anger, helplessness, and an overwhelming sadness I'd never felt before. When we arrived at the hospital, reality hit me even harder. The pain was so intense I could barely speak, and yet, on the way, my mother kept looking more at Helena than me. I knew I couldn't entirely blame her, but at that moment, all I wanted was for her to see me. The doctors confirmed it. Acute appendicitis. I needed immediate surgery, but as they wheeled me away, I felt like I was being left behind, like my own family had failed me. In the waiting room, Helena kept encouraging me, holding my hand as tears streamed silently down my face. It was then that I realized that perhaps, if I wanted to be seen and cared for, I would need to fight for myself, because waiting for my mother's attention to be enough was destroying me. The days after the surgery were difficult. The physical pain was intense, but the emotional pain was even greater. Carolina seemed relieved but still distant, and I could feel the guilt in her eyes, mixed with fear and confusion. I wanted to scream, cry, demand recognition, but anger paralyzed me. Deep down, I knew my mother meant no harm. She was overwhelmed, consumed by Helena's constant care. But the emotional neglect, even involuntary, left deep scars. I came to realize that my pain would always compete with my sister's and that my voice, my needs, could easily be ignored, even by those who should protect me above all else. It was Helena who began speaking for me. She knew I didn't want confrontation, but that I needed validation, that I needed to be seen. She spoke to my mother carefully, reminding her that I was important too, that my pain was real. I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief at finally having someone supporting me. Frustration at realizing my mother needed a constant reminder to see me. From that moment on, I began to understand that overcoming would not come from waiting for attention from those who failed, but from recognizing my own worth and fighting to be cared for and heard, even if that meant taking responsibility for my own emotional well-being. After discharge, life at home changed, but not immediately. Carolina tried to balance the care between Helena and me, but there were still days when her attention seemed unbalanced. I felt guilty for feeling hurt, because I knew she was doing the best she could. But the truth is, emotional. Neglect left invisible scars. With every fever, every ache, every cry for attention, I struggled with feelings of invisibility, resentment, and abandonment. I began to realize I needed to develop strategies for self-care. I researched health, learned how to manage my own appointments, read about emotional well-being, and began developing tools to manage my anxiety and frustration. The feeling that I couldn't fully depend on my mother pushed me to become more self-sufficient. And that's when I realized that the first step to overcoming it was recognizing responsibility for my own care, without relying on external validation. Helena became my emotional safe haven. She carried her own anxiety due to fibromyalgia and asthma, but she never stopped being there for me. I learned to trust her, to share my frustrations and pain, and this strengthened our relationship. But it was also painful to realize that a healthy relationship with her mother would require time, patience, and conscious communication. Every attempt to talk about my feelings was a risk, as it could result in misunderstandings or feelings of guilt in Carolina. But little by little, we realized that talking was necessary. We began establishing small rules, moments when we could express fear, anger, or frustration without judgment. It was the first time I felt I had a safe space for my emotions at home, and this became the foundation for my emotional rebuilding. The rebuilding process wasn't linear. There were days when I gave in to frustration and resentment, avoiding my mother, locking myself in my room. I felt a knot in my stomach, a tight throat, and tears insistently escaping when I realized I still needed her. But there were also days when Carolina visibly struggled, trying to make amends, and I felt I could open my heart. I learned to balance these moments, allowing her to show care without relinquishing my autonomy. Over time, the guilt I felt for wanting attention diminished, replaced by the understanding that my suffering didn't invalidate her efforts, but that my needs were legitimate and deserved to be recognized. In high school, the neglect I experienced at home was reflected in other ways. I isolated myself in academic pursuits, trying to compensate for the emotional void with external achievements. But this strategy was insufficient, and my emotional health began to take its toll. It was then that I sought therapy, which changed my life. Talking to someone impartial helped me recognize feelings of abandonment, anger, and insecurity, and allowed me to develop tools to communicate my needs without fear. With professional guidance, I learned to distinguish between blame and responsibility, and the importance of establishing clear boundaries, even within my own family. Learning to cope with emotional imbalance at home was like learning to walk in the dark. Each step required attention, courage, and patience. I learned to identify signs of emotional neglect, but also to appreciate small displays of care. I learned that my voice carried weight, and that I could claim space without being disrespectful or aggressive. The pain I felt that night with appendicitis still echoed, but it no longer defined me. I began to build my own narrative of someone who is not invisible, who deserves care, attention, and love. Despite all my efforts to strengthen myself, there were times when the past came flooding back. Sometimes, a severe stomach ache or a fever would make me feel the same fear I felt on the night of my appendicitis. My body would react before I could even think, my heart racing, my hands sweating, my breath shallow. I remembered the feeling of being ignored and the frustration of watching my mother struggle to share her attention. In those moments, Helena was my anchor. She held my hand, breathed with me, whispered words that reminded me that my pain was legitimate, that my body had a right to be cared for. I began to understand that this sisterly presence would be a constant in my life, something that couldn't replace my mother's care. But that gave me the strength to face my vulnerabilities without feeling alone. Over time, I realized I needed to consciously rebuild my relationship with Carolina. It wasn't enough to demand attention or expect her to notice my feelings. I needed to communicate. Confronting the mother I loved was painful, because every word was laced with guilt. "Mom, I needed you to see me that night," I said once, my voice trembling, my eyes watering. She swallowed, held my hand, and for the first time I realized the guilt I felt was mutual. It wasn't about blaming, but about understanding. I learned that asking for attention wasn't selfish, and that my mother also needed to learn to balance caring, even without giving up her own emotional burden. The rebuilding process was slow and full of setbacks. There were arguments, tears, long silences, but there were also moments of victory, small achievements. Carolina calling me to accompany me to appointments, asking about my health without needing to be reminded, listening to my frustrations without judgment. I learned to accept that change doesn't happen overnight, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but rather allowing the relationship to transform. My initial anger, the one that consumed me for years, began to give way to understanding and patience, even though I knew the scars would remain. At the same time, I sought to strengthen my independence. I began managing my own health, studying ways to cope with anxiety, and establishing self-care routines. This sense of autonomy gave me the confidence to face future crises without relying exclusively on my mother's attention. I learned to recognize signs of emotional neglect, but also to appreciate her efforts, no matter how small. This delicate balance brought me inner peace, because I realized that my happiness and security didn't need to be tied to external expectations, but to my own ability to take care of myself. Looking back today, I see that episode of appendicitis was a turning point. It showed me the fragility of family bonds when there is emotional imbalance, but it also revealed the strength we can develop when we allow ourselves to seek support, communication, and autonomy. I learned to acknowledge my needs without fear, to create space for my emotions, and to value relationships that strengthen me, like my connection with Helena. Despite the pain, I know it is possible to rebuild, and that overcoming doesn't mean the absence of scars, but rather learning to walk with them, transforming painful experiences into strength and resilience. After learning to deal with my own pain, I realized I also needed to address the guilt Carolina carried. She constantly felt inadequate, as if she had failed me irreparably. But when we began to open up and talk honestly, I realized her fear wasn't of losing me, but of not being able to balance her responsibilities with her children. These conversations were difficult because every word was charged with emotion and insecurity. I had pent up anger and sadness, and at the same time, I felt compassion for her. I learned that overcoming emotional neglect involves seeing the other person's humanity, acknowledging mistakes without losing yourself, and building a new way of relating based on presence, care, and active listening. Helena continued to be my constant support, but at the same time, I realized I needed to learn to support myself. I began developing emotional self-care strategies: meditation, writing, physical exercise, and psychological counseling. Each action was a reminder that my life didn't need to be defined by the neglect I suffered. I learned to value my own limits, recognize my achievements, and allow small victories to be celebrated. The fear of being forgotten still lingered, but the sense of control over my life and emotions grew, and this gave me the strength to face crises without feeling like the world was against me. The family rebuilding process was, above all, about communication and patience. Carolina made an effort to listen without interrupting, to acknowledge my needs, and to validate my experiences without minimizing my pain. I learned not to expect perfection, but consistency. Small, repeated actions that demonstrated care and presence. Every gesture, no matter how small, was a building block in rebuilding trust between us. I also learned that it was legitimate to express frustration when I felt my pain was being neglected, because my emotional well-being needed to be as much of a priority as Helena's health. In school and in my social life, I realized that carrying this emotional baggage made me more empathetic and attentive to the needs of others. I could spot signs of invisibility or devaluation in my friends, and this taught me the importance of clear communication and mutual support. At the same time, I learned that it was impossible to please everyone or expect constant attention from everyone. My energy needed to be preserved, and awareness of my limits allowed me to create healthier and more meaningful relationships, including my relationship with my mother, which gradually transformed from involuntary neglect to a more balanced and conscious presence. The hardest lesson was accepting that, despite my efforts, some emotional scars would remain. The memory of that night of appendicitis still makes me shudder, but it no longer paralyzes me. Today I know that my pain has value, that my existence doesn't need to be compared or made invisible, and that I can demand care without feeling guilty. This awareness gives me the strength to face future challenges, to establish clear boundaries, and to strengthen family relationships in a healthy way. I've learned that overcoming isn't about erasing the past, but transforming painful experiences into lessons in autonomy, empathy, and resilience. Today, looking back on my life, I realize that nothing was in vain. Every tear, every night of fear, every moment I felt invisible, served to teach me about resilience. I learned that we can't completely control the attention or actions of those we love, but we can control how we react to situations and how we care for ourselves. Carolina, my mother, still makes mistakes, still overwhelms herself with Helena, but open communication has allowed us to create a new balance. I know I can be seen and heard, and that my worth doesn't depend on others' perceptions, but on how I respect and care for myself. Helena remains my safe haven, but today we are life partners. learning together about boundaries, care, and empathy. Our bonds have strengthened not only through suffering, but through the way we support and understand each other. I've learned that overcoming challenges isn't just individual. Sometimes it depends on the presence of someone who recognizes us, listens to us without judgment, and is willing to walk alongside us. Having someone like her helped me realize that I don't have to face everything alone, and that sharing the burden of emotions is an essential step toward healing. What changed in me also transformed my relationship with Carolina. Today, I can see that she did the best she could in a context of overwhelm and fear. I learned to forgive without forgetting, to set clear boundaries, and to accept small gestures of care that would previously have gone unnoticed. This rebuilt relationship is still delicate, still requires effort, but there's room for trust and genuine presence. I understood that perfection isn't a requirement to be seen and loved. Consistency and intention count more than grandiose acts. If I could speak to the Raphael of 4 years ago, I would say, "Your pain is real. You deserve care, and everything will become easier with patience and courage." I would also say that there is no shame in needing help, in seeking emotional support, and in creating tools to strengthen yourself. Overcoming challenges doesn't happen magically. It is built with each conscious choice to not let resentment consume you, to not allow invisibility to define your life, and to actively seek connections that bring acceptance and strength. Today, I feel at peace, even though I carry scars. I've learned that family love can be complex and unequal, but that it's possible to rebuild trust, communicate needs, and create a safe space for everyone, even after unintentional neglect. My story isn't one of perfection, but of resilience, learning, and growth. If I could transform pain into strength, I know others can too. There is a path, and it starts with courage, communication, and the willingness to care for yourself, even when the world seems to forget you.